The first thing they remembered was a hum, faint and tremulous, like the breath of an old cello resting in its case. It slipped through the cracks of memory and into the room, tugging them from a shallow half-sleep. On nights like this, the house seemed alive in a shy, patient way. Dust floated in slender shafts of moonlight, each grain turning lazily as if reluctant to settle. They pulled the thin blanket tighter, unsure if the sound belonged to the wind or to something gentler, something waiting. Their feet touched the wooden floor, cool and steady. The boards sighed a little, familiar and forgiving. They moved carefully, not wanting to wake anyone else, though the hour had already hushed the house into a single soft breath. The hum grew clearer as they padded toward the attic stairs, an old ladder tucked behind a linen curtain. That ladder had always carried a quiet spell, creaking only enough to remind you that climbing meant entering a space set aside from ordinary time. The attic smelled of cedar and stories. Boxes lay scattered like sleepy animals, their labels smudged with age. There were quilts folded into calm hills, jars of buttons catching stray moonlight, a globe with oceans, the color of faded tea. And there, resting against the far wall, stood a lantern. Its glass was clouded, the metal handle cool and smooth. Inside, a pearl-colored glow pulsed, so faint one could almost mistake it for breath. They knelt beside it, fingers hovering just above the surface. The glow didn't waver, but the hum shifted, rising like the hush of a lullaby. It wasn't frightening. It felt like a hand reaching out, steady and kind. They sat cross-legged on the floor, their nightshirt brushing against their knees, and studied the lantern. Something about it suggested listening rather than looking, as though it preferred attention offered without hurry. Outside, a breeze pressed against the roof, carrying the scent of wet grass. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, and then fell silent again. The child traced the lantern's edge with a single fingertip. A warmth bloomed in their chest, quiet but certain, like recognizing a voice even before words are spoken. They imagined the lantern had been waiting, patient through seasons, for someone who would hear its secret. They tried to recall whether anyone had ever mentioned a lantern in the attic. Grandmother had told many tales of swans that slept in clouds, of cats who spoke only on rainy afternoons, yet none about this. Perhaps it had belonged to someone who liked keeping mysteries close, not as riddles to solve, but as gentle companions. That thought made them smile, small and private. Sitting there, they felt the stillness around them thicken, not heavy but protective. Shawl of quiet draped over narrow shoulders. Their eyelids drooped for a moment, and in that drowsy blink, they imagined a figure placing the lantern on the floor. Long ago, setting it down with a promise. They could almost see the outline. Kind eyes, patient hands, a whisper too soft to follow. When they opened their eyes fully, the lantern's glow trembled once, like a nod. They lifted it carefully. It was lighter than expected, yet solid enough to anchor their palms. Holding it close, they felt its hum soften, as if adjusting to their heartbeat. A tender calm swept over them, deeper than any they had known, as though the world itself had exhaled. They carried it to the attic window, where moonlight brushed their cheek. Outside, the garden gleamed silver. Leaves lay motionless on dark soil, and the stone path curved toward the orchard, blurred in mist. For a moment, they wondered what might happen if they stepped out now, lantern in hand, and wandered until dawn. But the warmth inside reminded them that adventures could begin quietly, with no need to rush. Cradling the lantern, they sat again, knees tucked up, chin resting on their arm. They thought of the people sleeping downstairs, gentle breaths behind closed doors, dreams weaving through cotton sheets. A swell of affection rose, filling the small space between ribs. The lantern pulsed in rhythm, as if echoing that feeling. Perhaps this was its way of speaking, of saying it knew the tender shape of care. Minutes slid by unnoticed. The attic's darkness softened to velvet. stitched with fine silver lines where moonlight found tiny cracks. They considered whispering to the lantern, testing if it could truly listen, but decided against it. Some friendships begin with silence, letting the first words arrive in their own time. The hum slowed, low and steady. They felt their shoulders loosen, their breath deepen. Down below, a clock marked the passing hour, with a single, muffled chime. It didn't startle them. It seemed to nod along with the quiet rhythm that now lived between them and the lantern. A soft certainty settled. They were meant to discover it tonight, to sit and breathe beside its gentle heart. At last they rose, placing the lantern where they had found it. Its light steadied, content. They brushed dust from their palms and looked once more at the globe, the buttons, the quilts, all of it cloaked in new warmth. As they descended the ladder, the hum faded, but left an echo in their chest, like the afterglow of a song you keep hearing even after silence returns. Back in bed, they curled beneath the blanket. Outside, stars stretched across the sky, patient and bright. Sleep crept nearer, weaving through the last thoughts of the lantern and its quiet welcome. They closed their eyes with a small sigh, feeling that something kind had begun, something without edges or hurry, only a promise, as soft as light. Morning arrived shyly, with pale light filtering through thin curtains. They woke to the smell of bread warming in the oven, and the faint rhythm of someone moving downstairs. For a moment they lay still, listening to the soft language of the house, the groan of timber stretching awake, the whisper of birds outside the kitchen wall. Last night's memory hovered near, tender and luminous, the lantern in the attic, its glow like a heartbeat they could almost touch. They slipped from bed and followed the familiar trail of scents and sounds to the kitchen. Grandmother stood at the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, kneading dough with practiced grace. She looked up, smiling the eyes that carried quiet laughter. "You're up early," she said, voice warm as rising steam. They nodded, uncertain whether to speak of the lantern. Something about it still felt private, like a story that needed more time before it was shared. Breakfast passed in calm ritual. Slices of bread, honey pooled in a shallow dish, tea steeping amber in a chipped mug. The garden outside was damp with dew, every blade of grass holding its own small star. After the dishes were stacked and the kettle rinsed, they wandered through the back door, feet bare on cool stone. The air smelled of mint and earth. Bees hummed lazily among the lavender, and a blackbird hopped across the path, tilting its head as if to greet them. They paused near the orchard fence, tracing a finger along the wood grain. Beyond it stretched a small meadow, where sunlight drifted through morning mist. The hush there felt similar to the lantern's glow, deep, waiting. They climbed the low gate and stepped into the field. Dew brushed their ankles, and a breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. It was as if the day had been expecting them. They wandered until they reached a crooked apple tree near the meadow's center. Its branches arched like open arms, and tiny apples glistened faintly in the pale sun. Settling against its trunk, they let their mind drift. Thoughts of the lantern mingled with quiet questions. Who had left it there? Why did it hum only when held close? No answers came, but the wondering itself felt gentle, like pebbles dropped into still water. When the sky brightened, they returned home, brushing grass from their legs. Grandmother was shelling peas on the porch, humming a tune without words. They sat beside her, and for a while they worked through it in companionable silence. She glanced at them once, eyes glinting. "Some things in this house have been waiting longer than we've been alive," she said softly, as if reading their thoughts. Then she smiled, returning to her peas, leaving the sentence to rest where it landed. Later they crept back to the attic. Dust swirled lazily in the sunbeam that cut across the ladder's top rung. The lantern was just where they had left it, its glass faintly clouded but steady, as though aware of being watched. They settled beside it, fingers tracing the grooves in its handle. A warmth spread again, filling the hollow of their chest. They didn't need words. The lantern seemed to hum an unspoken welcome, like an old friend pleased to see them again. Time passed unnoticed. They lay on their stomach, chin propped on folded arms, gazing at that quiet light. At one point they thought they heard a faint rhythm, almost like a lullaby. Perhaps it was only the wind brushing the eaves, yet the sound carried a softness that matched the lantern's pulse. They felt themselves drifting, not into sleep exactly, but into a calm that unknotted every thought. When shadows stretched long across the attic, they returned the lantern to its place. Downstairs, evening gathered in the corners of rooms, bringing the smell of soup and warm bread. At supper they laughed with grandmother over some small mistake involving too much salt. The laughter lingered even after the bowls were cleared. Later, lying in bed, they felt a steady gratitude for everything, for meals, for voices, for a glow waiting above the ceiling. The memory of the lantern settled beside them like a quiet promise. As they slipped into dreams, the following days unfurled in a rhythm as soft as cloth drying in sunlight. Mornings began with cool air slipping through windows, afternoons with slow wanderings through garden paths, evenings with stories told near the hearth. Yet beneath these simple hours ran a thread of anticipation. They couldn't help glancing upward, toward the attic door whenever footsteps paused in the hallway. One afternoon, clouds gathered low, heavy with rain. They found themselves curled on the rug by the window, tracing shapes in the condensation. The world smelled of damp stone and rosemary. Grandmother moved through the kitchen behind them, stirring a pot while humming a tune they recognized but couldn't name. Something in the melody reminded them of the lantern, its hum, its secret steadiness. When the rain began, they asked if they could fetch a book from the attic. Grandmother nodded, eyes amused, as though she sensed the real reason for the visit. Climbing the ladder, they felt the same hush gather around them, though this time it carried the perfume of rain sliding along the roof. The lantern's glow brightened slightly as they entered, like an ember stirred by breath. They sat cross-legged, studying its faint shimmer. Today, curiosity outpaced hesitation. They brushed a finger along its rim and whispered hello, hardly aware they'd spoken aloud. The hum deepened in response, not louder, but fuller, as if acknowledging their greeting. Encouraged, they spoke again, words tumbling shyly. They told the lantern about the rain, about how puddles mirrored the sky, about their wish to understand where the light came from. The lantern stayed silent, yet something in its quiet made their chest loosen, as though being heard mattered more than any reply. A memory stirred. Grandmother once saying that every home holds a few kindly secrets waiting for people who know how to listen. Perhaps this was one of them. They leaned closer, forehead almost touching the glass. A warmth spread through the air, tender as hands smoothing rumpled fabric. They imagined someone long ago cradling the lantern as they were now, perhaps whispering their own hopes into its soft heart. A sudden clap of thunder startled them. The lantern flickered, casting delicate ripples across the attic beams. They drew it closer instinctively, holding it as one might a sleeping kitten. The storm passed quickly, leaving only rain's gentle applause. Afterward, the attic felt cleaner, edges of light sharper against the wooden floor. They spent the rest of the afternoon there, talking in a half-whisper about things they'd never shared aloud. Favorite scents, secret fears, the way they sometimes wished time would slow so they could notice Venice. Each confession felt like placing smooth stones into calm water. They didn't know if the lantern understood, but its glow held steady, a constant companion. Evening descended like ink, spilling through paper. Reluctantly, they set the lantern back, fingers lingering on its handle. They promised silently to return. When they climbed down, the house welcomed them with lamplight and the smell of stew. Grandmother ladled soup into a bowl, glancing up with a knowing smile. No words passed about the attic. yet they sensed she approved of their quiet explorations. After supper, they curled on the sofa with a blanket as grandmother read aloud from an old book, her voice low and steady, braided with the rain still tapping at the window. As sleep drew near, they felt an unfamiliar bravery, a readiness to meet whatever stories the lantern held. That night, dreams came luminous and slow, filled with warm corridors and soft glowing shapes guiding them through rooms without doors. When morning returned, they carried the dreams calm into waking. Birds stitched songs through clear air, and the garden shone freshly washed. They knew they would visit the lantern again, but not with haste. Some friendships, they realized, grew in the spaces between days, stretching like ivy over the quiet walls of the heart. Morning broke clear and cool, carrying a hint of pine from the woods beyond the garden. They woke slowly, letting the breeze graze their face through an open window. Downstairs, the faint scrape of chair legs and the rustle of a newspaper suggested grandmother had already begun her quiet rituals. They lay for a while, remembering the lantern's glow, the way it had pulsed in sympathy with their heartbeat. Even in daylight, the thought shimmered like a soft ribbon, drawing them upward toward the attic. But before climbing, they wandered outside, barefoot on dew-damp grass. The orchard smelled of sunlit bark and tender fruit. Bees moved from blossom to blossom, their wings murmuring as though the whole garden breathed with them. They followed the stone path to the low gate at the field's edge, pausing where wildflowers swayed against the fence. Everything held stillness beneath its movement, a patience mirrored in the memory of the lantern's hum. The sky stretched pale blue, brushed with slow-moving clouds. They leaned on the gate, chin resting on crossed arms, and watched the wind comb through tall grass. Somewhere nearby, water lapped against stones, a sound they didn't often hear. Curiosity tugged gently. They slipped through the gate and followed the quiet music until it led them to a narrow stream, hidden by ferns. Its surface gleamed silver where sunlight reached between leaves. Bending close, they dipped a hand into the water, feeling its coolness rush past their palm. The current seemed to speak, not in words but in the same language of calm that lived inside the lantern. They sat on the bank for a long while, tracing circles in the shallow flow. Now and then a bird flashed across the clearing, scattering ripples with its shadow. It felt as though the world invited them to notice its smallest gestures, the hush before a breeze, the sigh of grass bending, the quiet insistence of running water. These details filled them with a fragile happiness, a sense that life's gentlest parts were waiting to be seen. When they finally returned indoors, grandmother was polishing spoons at the table. She looked up with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Exploring?" she asked. They nodded, hesitant to speak of streams or secrets, unsure how to explain how alive the morning had felt. She didn't press, only slid a plate toward them, slices of apple, still cool from shade. They ate slowly, savoring sweetness and silence alike. Later, they climbed to the attic, heart quickening in anticipation. Dust floated lazily in the beam of sun that fell through a small window. The lantern rested exactly where it always had, steady in its patient glow. They knelt, greeting it with a breath rather than words, as if that were the language it preferred. The hum unfurled again, wrapping them in warmth. They traced a finger along the glass and felt calm settle over their shoulders. Something new happened. Then, as they watched, faint shapes flickered across the lantern's cloudy pane, not clear images, more like suggestions made of light. A curve of hillside, a silhouette turning toward laughter, a cluster of stars half hidden behind fog. They blinked, unsure whether the shapes lived inside the lantern or inside their own drowsy gaze. Either way, the sight filled them with wonder rather than unease. They leaned closer, careful not to breathe too hard on the glass. Time softened. Minutes seemed to elongate, stretching thin, like honey sliding from a spoon. They felt that if they spoke too loudly, the moment might scatter, so they whispered instead, small observations about the garden, not how the stream had sounded like a memory of rain. The lantern's glow shifted gently, as if acknowledging each sentence. A sense of companionship thickened, quiet and real, despite its wordlessness. Eventually they lay back against an old trunk, letting their eyelids rest halfway. Through the half-light, rafters curved above like ribs of a sleeping giant. They imagined the lantern as its heart, steady and luminous, beating a slow rhythm older than the house itself. The idea made them smile, easing something hidden behind their ribs. Shadows lengthened as the afternoon deepened. They rose, placing the lantern carefully in its usual spot. It pulsed once, faint but certain, as though sending them off. Downstairs, grandmother was setting the table. She glanced up, eyes bright with a warmth that asked no questions. They helped lay out bowls and napkins, finding comfort in the gentle choreography of hands and plates. That night, after supper, they sat with grandmother on the porch. The sky had turned a deep indigo, pricked with early stars. Fireflies hovered over the hedges, blinking soft signals into darkness. Grandmother hummed the tune they'd heard before, the one that reminded them of rain and light. Leaning against her shoulder, they felt a belonging that wrapped around them like the night air, unhurried, unspoken, whole. When sleep finally pulled them inside, the memory of the lantern followed, a quiet gleam within closed eyes. They drifted off, imagining its patient glow, keeping watch above, holding space for all the small wonders they had yet to discover. Dawn slipped through thin curtains, laying stripes of gold across the floor. They stirred, stretching like a cat before stepping into the hush of morning. The scent of toast drifted up the stairwell, a homely reminder of warmth below, yet even as they followed it down, their mind reached upward toward the attic, to the lantern's quiet heart. It felt like a promise waiting at the edge of each new day. After breakfast, grandmother handed them a basket and asked for help gathering mint leaves. The garden was alive with dew, each drop a small jewel on the leaves. They clipped sprigs carefully, placing them in the basket until the air smelled sweet and green. While working, they heard the distant rush of the stream they'd found the day before. Its song mingled with bird song, weaving a melody both new and ancient. Later, they climbed to the attic, careful not to spill bits of mint from their pocket. Sunlight pooled around the lantern like a soft lake. As soon as they drew near, the hum bloomed, steady and low. They sat cross-legged, laying the mint sprigs nearby, and spoke softly about the morning, the wet grass, the stream's whisper, grandmother's smile. The lantern glowed in rhythm, a companion made of light. They began to sense that the lantern wanted something, not possession, but presence. It seemed to invite stillness, to teach them the shape of attention. So they stayed there, quiet, letting thoughts settle until only breath and glow remained. In that calm they felt a new tenderness for everything, for the dust motes spinning slowly, for their own heartbeat, for the unseen hands that had once set this lantern here. When dusk folded over the fields, they left the attic with mint-scented fingers. Grandmother brewed tea with the leaves, and together they sat on the porch, cradling warm cups. The horizon wizened from gold to lilac, and somewhere an owl tested its voice. They sipped in silence, content, carrying the attic's peace into night. Rain returned the next morning, pattering lightly against window panes. The air was cool, rich with the smell of wet earth. They spent part of the morning helping grandmother arrange jars of jam on a shelf, lining them so their ruby and amber contents caught the dim light. The work felt simple, satisfying, like setting colors inside a song. By afternoon, the rain eased, leaving droplets clinging to every leaf. They climbed the attic ladder, curiosity bright as the lantern itself. Today, its glow felt deeper, casting faint halos on the wooden beams. They sat and watched, letting quietness sink into their bones. For a long time, neither child nor lantern moved, except for the slight sway of shadows. Then something subtle stirred, a shift inside the hum, almost like a sigh. They leaned closer, heart quickening, though not from fear. The sound held comfort, as though the lantern was speaking in a language made of pauses. They answered without words, simply laying a hand near its base. Warmth radiated up their palm, a slow tide. They closed their eyes and images floated behind their lids. Not sharp pictures, but tender impressions. An old orchard heavy with blossom. Someone humming a lullaby, rain pooling in stone bowls. They couldn't if these belonged to the lantern's past or their own unfolding heart. Either way, they welcomed them. When they opened their eyes, the attic felt changed, as though it had inhaled with them. They lingered until shadows stretched long, then descended quietly. Evening brought a stew fragrant with rosemary, and grandmother's stories of her childhood. Later, they fell asleep to the south. Next day dawned bright, the world washed clean by rain. They woke early, feeling a steady eagerness, like soft wind urging a sail. Grandmother asked if they'd gather eggs from the henhouse. Chickens clucked gently as they moved among them, collecting warm ovals into a wicker basket. The task felt kind, an exchange of care between creature and hand. Afterward, they wandered toward the stream again, following its path deeper than before. Sunlight laced through branches, speckling their arms. They found a flat stone and sat, watching dragonflies skim the surface. Time loosened, each moment stretching until only water and breath existed. They realized the same stillness they felt with the lantern could be found here too, in the tender patience of living things. When they finally climbed the attic ladder, the lantern's glow greeted them like a quiet smile. They set the eggs carefully aside, then settled on the floor. Today they spoke about the stream, about how its clear current seemed to keep stories. They imagined the water carrying echoes of voices, laughter caught between ripples. The lantern pulsed gently, as if amused. Hours passed softly. They traced lazy circles in dust, inventing small tales for every creak in the rafters. Eventually they rose, reluctant to break the spell. Evening drifted in, carrying supper's scents, roasted vegetables, thyme, fresh bread. Grandmother's eyes shone when they came down, as if she sensed how deeply they were learning to listen. An end of water dripping from eaves, carrying with it the lantern's calm. Another morning, mist hovered over the field like a sheet waiting to be lifted. They tiptoed outside, enjoying the hush that blankets the world before anyone stirs. Their breath mingled with fog as they crossed the orchard. Apples glistened softly, each holding a pale reflection of the sky. Later, drawn by habit and wonder, they ascended to the attic. The lantern shimmered more brightly than ever, as though the mist had polished its glow. They approached slowly, feeling its quiet attention on them. Sitting close, they rested their chin on folded hands and let silence settle. A warmth seeped into their chest, easing everything taut and hurried. They began to speak about small matters, the shape of clouds, the way dew turns spiderwebs into necklaces, the comfort of grandmother's voice when she reads aloud. While they talked, the lantern's hum hibbened, steady as a heartbeat beneath layers of wood and time. They thought of how some friendships grow not through words but through shared presence, and felt certain the lantern understood. As afternoon waned, they placed the lantern back in its spot. Before leaving, they whispered a promise to keep looking gently at the world, to keep noticing. The glow quivered in answer, faint but sure. That evening they helped grandmother bake bread, kneading dough until their hands smelled of warmth. When darkness settled, they dreamed of mist lifting to reveal hidden meadows and a soft light waiting just beyond. Sunlight arrived clear and strong, scattering the last of the mist. They felt an easy contentment as they joined grandmother on the porch for tea. Together they watched butterflies tumble between lavender stalks, wings catching morning fire. The peace of that moment seemed stitched to the memory of the lantern, as though its glow had sown a quiet seam through their days. In the afternoon they gathered fallen branches by the stream, arranging them into shapes: a small bridge, a circle, a line pointing home. They felt as if they were speaking a language made of twigs and water, a conversation older than words. When they finally returned to the attic, the lantern welcomed them with steady radiance. They sat and listened, letting their breath match its gentle rhythm. Time unfurled, slow and soft. They thought about kindness, how even the smallest gesture, like smoothing a wrinkled sheet or saving a crumb for birds, could ripple farther than one might guess. They imagined the lantern had been kept alive by such quiet acts, passed from careful hands to careful hands. A warmth rose in them, sweet and calm. They stayed until dusk painted the walls, amber, then left, carrying its hush like a pocket of light. A breeze threaded through curtains at dawn, cool and scented with clover. They dressed quickly, eager to step outside. The world felt expectant, as if holding its breath. They wandered through tall grass, brushing fingertips across seed heads. Above, swallows looped and dived, tracing loose calligraphy against the sky. Later they found grandmother shelling peas on the porch. She smiled, offering a handful to taste. They spoke quietly about nothing in particular, yet every word felt rich, woven with care. Afterward they climbed to the attic, basket of peas still warm in their lap. The lantern glowed faintly, patient as ever. They placed the peas aside and sat close, feeling the day's brightness soften in its company. Something inside them stirred, a wish to honor what the lantern had given. They didn't know how, only that gratitude wanted a shape. So they closed their eyes and let thanks bloom silently, a small offering sent outward. The lantern's light grew tender, spreading across the floor like spilled honey. For a long while they stayed there, folded in calm. When evening arrived, they descended gently, as though carrying a fragile secret. Supper tasted sweeter for reasons they couldn't name, and as night wrapped the house, they felt the lantern's glow alive in their own quiet heart. The winter that followed was quiet, the kind that presses its ear against the earth and listens. The garden, where the river once laughed, lay beneath a veil of frost, every leaf wearing a small crown of white. They would walk there most mornings, wrapped in scarves that smelled faintly of cedar, leaving gentle prints that disappeared by noon. Change had settled over them like a snowfall, soft, patient, inevitable. There were fewer letters waiting in the lantern now, fewer notes from those who had drifted on, but what remained was deeper, slower, and kind. Their friend met them often at the bend of the path, carrying a thermos of tea and a smile so warm it seemed to bend the air around it. They spoke of little things, the sound of ice cracking on the river, a dream where they were both birds following the same silver current. Sometimes they said nothing at all, letting their breath curl up like tiny clouds. Silence, they learned, could be as generous as words. One dusk, as the sky bruised into lavender, they paused near the half-buried stones where the old storyteller once sat. The bench was slick with frozen dew, yet they brushed it clean and sat together. Their shoulders touched, and for a while they simply watched the stars emerge one by one. A feeling stirred inside, not quite sadness, not exactly joy. It was the quiet knowledge that life was moving, as it always had, and that they were ready to walk beside it. Later, by the hearth, they traced patterns in the steam of their mugs, remembering how the lantern had once taught them to listen for what couldn't be seen. Even as its light faded upstairs, its lessons stayed: patience, tenderness, the courage to hold both beginnings and endings with steady hands. And that night, as they drifted towards sleep, they felt as though the stars themselves were rocking them gently, whispering that every ending was secretly a soft beginning. Spring came slowly, carrying scents of thawed soil and new grass. Buds trembled on the branches, hesitant but determined. They spent long afternoons on the porch, watching pale petals loosen from the trees and glide into the breeze. Sometimes they read aloud from old notebooks, their voice quiet enough to let the birds keep singing. Other times they simply leaned back, eyes half closed, grateful for warmth on their skin. The river had changed with the seasons. Its banks were wider now, lined with smooth stones polished by melted snow. Standing at its edge, they felt the water's memory, the echoes of laughter, the hushed promises, even the shadow of tears. All of it belonged as naturally as clouds belong to the sky. Their companion joined them for a small journey upriver, carrying a basket with bread, apples, and a wedge of cheese. They followed the water until it narrowed between mossy rocks. There they spread a blanket and shared an unhurried meal, watching sunlight skip from wave to wave. They spoke about the years behind them, about the way the lantern's glow had taught them to hold quiet moments close. They spoke, too, about the paths ahead, not in sharp lines but in soft curves that invited exploration. As evening came, they built a tiny cairn of stones to honor everything they'd learned. No words were needed. The stack stood as a quiet witness, a reminder that lives are layered, one careful choice at a time. Walking back beneath the violet sky, they felt lighter, like someone who had finally made peace with the rhythm of tides and roots. When sleep found them later, it arrived like a warm tide, bringing dreams of rivers that never end. The attic smelled faintly of dust and lilac when they returned. They climbed the ladder slowly, feeling each rung under their palms. Moonlight streamed through the small, round window, painting silver paths across old trents and folded quilts. At the center sat the lantern, still and quiet, its glass holding only the faintest gleam. They knelt beside it, fingers brushing the cool metal, and felt a soft pulse, not of light but of memory. They stayed there for a while, letting recollections drift through them. The first time they'd heard the lantern's hum, the way it had listened when no one else could, the countless evenings it had wrapped them then calm. They whispered thanks, not aloud, but with the steady language of the heart. Downstairs, their friend waited with 2 cups of chamomile tea. They sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching the moon ride high above the darkened trees. They spoke about how journeys rarely end with doors closing. They end when someone realizes they've arrived and that they can carry what they've gathered without clutching it too tightly. Later, they returned to the attic, placed the lantern carefully on a worn shelf, and covered it with a cloth, the color of dusk. They did not feel loss, only a spacious tenderness, as though the room itself was exhaling. Leaving the attic, they took one last look, not a farewell, but a quiet promise that everything bright stays somewhere inside, even when it no longer needs to shine. That night, lying beneath an open window, they let the cool air brush their skin. Stars spilled across the sky. Steady and unhurried, they felt whole, not because nothing had changed, but because change had been gentle, and they had walked with it every step. A final thought floated through them as sleep gathered, gratitude, simple and wide, like the sky itself. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, my friend. The morning arrived soft and golden, spilling through the windows with a light that seemed to pause just for a moment, to linger on the floorboards. They woke slowly, feeling the warmth brush their cheeks and the quiet rhythm of the house settling around them. Even the trees outside seemed to breathe with them, leaves trembling as if in time with their heartbeat. The world felt patient, inviting them to step gently into the day. They wandered to the garden first, barefoot on grass still cool from night dew. Tiny buds opened along the branches, tentative and shy, yet determined to stretch toward the sun. The scent of earth and new growth clung to their fingers as they walked, each step a small connection to the rhythm of life. Somewhere nearby, the river hummed its familiar song, winding past stones, polished smooth by winter's melt. They followed the sound for a while, letting it guide them, letting it remind them that motion could be calm, that movement could be gentle. Later they returned to the attic, the familiar ladder beneath their palms. Dust motes swirled in golden light streaming through the window, each a tiny floating world. The lantern waited quietly, a small heart beating in rhythm. With their own, they knelt before it, tracing the curves of its handle, and felt the warmth that had always been there. Patient, forgiving, full of quiet wisdom. It seemed to pulse in response to their breath, as though it had been waiting for this very morning. They spoke softly to it, telling the lantern about the river, about the buds on the trees, about how the garden smelled after rain. Their words were gentle and fragmented, like petals carried on a slow breeze. The lantern did not answer, yet the hum deepened, vibrating through the floor and into their chest. They realized that its companionship was never about speech. It was about attention, about presence, about the way the smallest things could hold meaning if noticed carefully. Hours passed unnoticed. They leaned back on the floor, arms folded beneath their chin, letting their eyes wander across the attic. Each object, the quilts, the jars, the faded books, seemed to hum with memory. They imagined all the hands that had touched this space before them, each one leaving a trace, a small echo. They felt connected to those quiet histories, as if the attic itself was a vast archive of care, patience, and love. When evening came, they descended slowly, carrying a sense of calm with them. Grandmother had set the table with a simple supper: bread, roasted vegetables, and a pot of fragrant tea. They sat together, talking quietly about the day, about moments of light and shadow, about things that had made them pause. Laughter appeared in small doses, like sparkles along the rim of their cups. They felt gratitude for its presence, for companionship, for warmth, for steady, unfussy love. After supper, they ventured into the orchard, one last time before the sky darkened fully. The moon rose pale and soft, casting silver over branches and stones. Their companion walked beside them, hand brushing against theirs, sharing a silence that needed no explanation. They paused at a small clearing where a stone bench stood. Sitting, they leaned back, letting the night envelope them. The stars blinked slowly, and the air smelled faintly of clover and earth. They spoke then, not in sentences but in feelings, about endings that were beginnings, about quiet joys, about the steady pull of the world beneath them. They felt the weight of all that had passed, yet it did not burden them. It was a gentle layering, a weaving of days into something soft and unbroken. Here, beneath the moon, they understood that the lantern's glow, now absent from the attic, had never truly left. It lived in the way they noticed, in the way they held, in the way they breathed alongside the world. When they returned inside, they found Grandmother waiting with a blanket and 2 cups of chamomile tea. They sipped in silence, letting warmth spread through their fingers, through their chest. Outside, the wind murmured against the windows, carrying a lullaby older than memory. They felt a deep contentment, a quiet understanding that every small act of care, every moment of attention, every soft word had left its mark. Later, lying beneath the window, eyes tracing constellations, they felt sleep approach like a tide. Each breath seemed to carry them farther into calm, farther into quiet reflection. The lantern's lessons had taken root: patience, presence, love, and the courage to notice. And as their eyelids drifted closed, they felt a final, tender exhale, the world expansive and gentle, and themselves part of its steady pulse. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, my friend. The morning that followed felt different, though nothing had changed at all. Sunlight stretched across the floor in gentle, wide strokes, illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. They woke slowly, sensing that something had settled within them, a softness, a quiet completeness. like the last note of a song held in the chest for a heartbeat longer. The house moved around them as it always had, creaking softly, breathing quietly, carrying the scent of baked bread and old wood. They rose and wandered to the attic one final time. The ladder felt familiar beneath their hands, the floorboards steady underfoot. The lantern rested in its usual spot, but now its glow was faint, almost shy. They knelt beside it, brushing the cool metal handle gently, and felt a warmth bloom in their chest. It was not the urgency of light that had once drawn them, but the quiet understanding that what mattered was not the glow itself, but what it had taught them. Patience, presence, the courage to hold small wonders close. They whispered softly, not words of asking, but words of gratitude, for the glow, for the hum, for the way it had held space for them, for the attic and its dust and beams, for the quilts and jars that had watched over countless moments, for grandmother's voice, steady and comforting, for the companion who walked with them through streams and gardens and meadows, and for themselves, for noticing, for feeling, for growing without needing to hurry. The day stretched ahead like soft fabric. They wandered outside, barefoot on the warm grass, letting the sun press its gentle weight against their shoulders. The orchard shimmered in its ordinary beauty, apples turning slowly along their branches, buds trembling in the light wind. They felt the world move around them, slow, tender, patient, and realized that even in ordinary motion there was magic. Every leaf, every stone, every ripple in the stream carried a small secret, waiting only for someone willing to see. Their companion joined them by the river, carrying a small basket of bread and berries. They sat on the bank, listening to water run over stone, letting its melody seep into their chest. They spoke quietly about the seasons, about streams, about moments they would remember, not because they were grand, but because they were real. Words were simple, almost fragments, but they held a deep rhythm, the rhythm of listening, of noticing, of sharing presence. As afternoon turned to evening, they returned to the attic one last time. The lantern's glow pulsed faintly in welcome. They knelt and ran a hand over its surface, feeling the warmth, the steady hum beneath their fingers. A thought occurred to them. All things that leave marks do so quietly, nothing needed to shout, nothing needed to illuminate to matter. What mattered was attention, care, and the patience to remain present through all the small acts of living. They left the attic, carrying the lessons softly inside them. The sun dipped low, spilling its last light across fields and trees, setting gold edges on everything. They walked slowly, companion at their side, through the orchard, across the stream, along the garden path. Every step was deliberate, soft, full of awareness. Even the breeze felt alive with meaning, whispering against hair and clothing, reminding them of the steady pulse of life beneath all motion. That night, they sat by the hearth with grandmother. Tea steamed between them, warm and fragrant, mingling with the scent of wood smoke. They spoke little because little was enough. The quiet of the room, the warmth of the fire, the companionship that needed no words, it was enough. And in that sufficiency, they understood that the world had been generous always in ways that didn't demand notice, yet revealed themselves to those who paused to see. Later, lying beneath the open window, they traced constellations with their eyes. Stars scattered across the sky in patient, silver bursts, each one steady in its place, each one holding a quiet glow. They breathed in tandem with the night, letting it fill every hollow with calm. They felt the lantern's lesson within them, a quiet heart, an attentive mind, a willingness to notice, to care, to hold what is gentle and true without trying to grasp it. They thought about endings, they thought about beginnings, and they realized that often the two were inseparable, like tide and shore, like breath and body. They could hold both at once, and in doing so, feel complete. Gratitude swelled within them, wide as the sky, and deep as the earth beneath. There was no rush, no urgency, only presence, only calm, only the soft rhythm of life continuing its slow, tender passage. Their eyelids grew heavy. They breathed in and then out and felt the pulse of the world with them, steady and constant. The lantern's glow, the river, the orchard, the attic. Grandmother's voice, their companion's quiet presence, all of it lived in them now, carried gently, treasured quietly. Sleep descended like a tide, and they welcomed it, curling into its softness with a sense of home in every breath. And as they drifted fully into that gentle night, they smiled. The glow they had followed, the hum they had cherished, the quiet lessons they had learned, all remained alive, inside and around them, steady and patient, waiting for tomorrow. And somewhere they realized they were still walking through the orchard, still following the river, still listening, still noticing, still holding the soft light of all that mattered. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, my friend.